Hey, everybody. Since we didn't have class the other day, I'm going to make sure that we are all kind of caught up and on the same page going forward. So here's kind of an abbreviated version of an abbreviated PowerPoint. Um, I won't take up too much of your time. I know you guys have a lot to do and a lot on your minds right now. So I'm just going to try to stick to the real high points of this. So please try to watch the entire thing and kind of lock in. You have those guided notes if you want to use those will be beneficial for you. Um, Now, here we go. Um, we always talk about the importance of the time period of the French Revolution, the 1789 to 1799. Basically, it's sort of pretty shortly after the American Revolution, and that's, no coincidence. And even if you think what else, took place right around that same time was the 7 Years' War. A lot of the causes of the French Revolution have to do with major money issues that stem from those two events. If you don't recall, France helped out America quite a bit during the American Revolution, and of course, France spent a ton of money during the 7 Years' War, in which they ultimately lost. Um, this is some of the major issues behind it. However, there are some more which we'll talk about. Never are there in history is there's never really one reason for anything. There's always a bunch of things, and major events happen as a result of a culmination of a number of things. But those are some kind of important things to sort of keep in mind. We also kind of got to, I know we all got to this slide here where we talked about the phases and stages of the French Revolution. Before I get too far into this, one of the things I really kind of want to point out is that, revolutions just don't happen out of the blue. There are reasons that cause major upheaval in countries and major upheaval in governments. Often they stem from, people suffering from a lack of money, money issues, or of course, even a lack of food. And in this case, a lot of it is, that lack of food, lack of money, but also this recognition that there is a great deal of injustice and inequality in society. And what is important to kind of take note about the French Revolution, and really any revolution for that matter, other than if it's some kind of, military coup in some banana republic, is revolutions happen, with the best intentions. They happen with the intention of making a better country, making a better world, making life better for people. However, unfortunately, it doesn't always go that way. And often revolutions of this nature and many others like it go south. They get bloody, they get dangerous, and ultimately they get really problematic in the long run. So let's talk quick about French society. To kind of keep things simple, that's what we're trying to do here is there are really two major sides, right? We have sort of the old order. They're the ones who want to preserve the old ways. They want to maintain the absolute monarchy. They want to maintain the privileges of the church and the aristocracy, that being the nobility. Now, when we talk about privilege, it's something a little bit different than what we would kind of think of today. These are where literally the laws are different. Where if you're a member of the nobility, that you have major tax breaks, you don't pay taxes, and your other privileges as well that you get that go along with your title, as far as being involved in government, and the list goes on and on. Even as something simple as being able to carry a sword in public. And then you have your other side, which is sort of like everyone else. To make it simple, you think of it as like being the haves versus the have-nots. However, we know in life that it's not always that simple, right? So who is sort of going against the absolute monarchy, the aristocrats, and of course the privilege of the church. Well, at the top you have these bourgeoisie. They're the wealthy, educated business owners. They're the ones that are enlightenment minded. They're the ones who are kind of the driving force behind these new enlightenment principles and these new ideas of government. Then you also have, even within that group, you have radicals who want a republic. Now, mind you, not everybody wants a republic in the French Revolution. A lot of people just want minor, moderate reform to go from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional or limited monarchy. The idea of a republic and getting rid of a king altogether is a very dangerous one. Okay. You also have your urban population living in the cities. And of course, you have your peasant populations in the countryside, farmers, whether they're farmers who own land or they're peasants who work the land of nobles, which we'll kind of get to a little bit later. But these are sort of the major players in the French Revolution. And to kind of say it's the haves versus the have-nots isn't necessarily true because, well, the bourgeoisie are very much the haves. They have a great deal of wealth. They have a great deal of things going for them. But where their inequality comes in is sort of that they don't have the same privileges and rights that, say, those in the aristocracy have. Okay. Now, to really truly understand what's the major problem in the French society, you have to understand what is going on as far as the social classes are concerned. Unlike today, where our social classes are based on socioeconomic status, you can be born poor and die the most wealthy person in the world in our country. Not that everyone, is going to legitimately have that opportunity. It is possible. Where in France, it wasn't necessarily the case during this time. It was very difficult for people to get ahead because of their plot or lot in life. At the very top, you have the royal family. The royal family is basically acting outside of the French estates. They're the power, right? They're the ones who hold all the power in France, all the political power in France, all the say. Below them, you have about 1% of the population. This is the members of the Roman Catholic Church, or the clergy. The church played a really important role in people's lives during this time period. Most of the people in France were Roman Catholic. They had a great deal of influence over the royal family and other nobles, and even influence over the commoners. Church was a very important part of people's lives. But again, also, we talk about privilege. The Roman Catholic Church had a great deal of privilege and rights going for it. Below them, you have the second estate. These are the nobles, the nobility, the aristocracy. They're about 2% of the population. The second estate obviously holds the high, military positions, the high political positions, a lot of local positions. They're also major landowners. And again, they have a lot of rights and privileges that most of the commoners, if you do quick math, about 97% of the population does not have. Interesting to note as well is that many of the most powerful figures of the clergy in the first estate were also nobles and nobility. Okay, if you were to draw a line right here, this is essentially where all your power lies. Your ideological power, much of your political power, your power amongst social groups, and I don't really truly want to say economic power because, largely this is where your economic power lies. However, not entirely, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Below them, you basically have your third estate. This is essentially your commoners. Right? And this is 97% of the population. They do not have the same rights and privileges and abilities that those above them do. So when we talk about equality, when we talk about injustice, when we talk about, a lot of these principles that we hold dear in our country, these are the kind of things that they were critiquing. When they were talking about freedom of religion, they were talking about the power and influence the Roman Catholic Church, say, had over the French government. Okay. Now, if you notice, there's a little bit of space there because I want to be able to break down the third estate, because to truly understand what is going on in France, you kind of have to understand a little bit of the different aspects of who comprises this 97%. And at the top, you have the bourgeoisie. Okay, these are your wealthy, individuals who are commoners. They're educated, they're successful, they're self-made. I mean, they use the term new money, right? This is, these are people who, again, are just in some cases just as wealthy as members of the second estate, but they don't have the same privileges and rights that they do. These are going to be the people who are the driving force and the leaders behind the revolution. Okay. Below them, you have your urban workers, okay, or your city workers or your city dwellers. But essentially, these are people who are wage workers. Right, they're working for money. They're working, jobs within the city. They don't really own property, right? They don't own land like the bourgeoisie do, or like the nobles do, or like the church does. They have their homes, right? And they go to work and they earn money, and then they go, to market and they buy their food and they buy the things they need. Okay, they are about 10% of the population, right? And this 10% obviously are living in cities. The urban workers are going to be your sort of the ones who are very volatile, the ones who are very socially active. A lot of the protests and the riots and a lot of the things that occur happen because of because of these urban workers. And these are the groups of people who later we're going to refer to them as the sans culottes a little bit later on in the lecture, or later on in this unit. But they're the ones who are going to kind of be used by a lot of the different political agents, into like the radical groups who want to push for a republic, and the urban workers who are going to kind of like really align themselves with that to a great extent. Below them, you have your bulk of your population. That 80% of the population are rural farmers. Now, these rural farmers are sort of even broken up into two more groups. You have rural farmers who own land and rural farmers who work the land of the nobility. Okay, but mostly they're just focused on their lives, right? They're just, growing food. They're surviving the winter. They're going and getting their Jesus on Sundays, and their lives are very simple, right? And they don't really concern themselves too much with what's all the nonsense that's going on in the cities or all the madness that's going on elsewhere. They just kind of want to survive and live, okay? And what their sort of worries are and their needs are, hey, as long as we have food, we're happy. Now, it's important to note before we move on that those people above them, right, especially like the urban workers, do not grow their own food. Okay, many of the bourgeoisie do not grow their own food. Okay, this is an important part of kind of like the bigger picture, which we're going to kind of get to later, because there is going to be a food shortage, and you're going to see how that impacts these urban workers, right? We can kind of sort of like, it's sort of an analog comparison of what we saw, during the lockdown days of COVID, where shelves were kind of barren, right? Because, well, we don't really produce food, right? This to me is one of the most important slides of the entire PowerPoint. What it's basically showing you is this. If you were to look at, the left pie chart and then the right pie chart, nothing would really jump out at you, right? The left pie chart saying, hey, 97% of the population pays 100% of the taxes. That doesn't really throw up any red flags, right? But when you look at that middle chart, this is where things kind of get a little bit dicey and where some of the problems kind of emerge in French society. You have now, okay, well, the nobility, which is only 2% of the population, owns 1/4 of all the land in France. The church, which is a very small percentage of people in the country, own 10% of the land. And they're not taxed for any of it, right? So you're seeing is an overtaxation on the commoners. Okay, this is an important part of the story, all right? But again, this doesn't even paint the whole picture. Think back to our, last slide where we talked about those different social groups, and we talked about, the third estate, and we talked about the bourgeoisies and the city workers, right? And we mentioned about how the city workers are about 10% of the population. They don't really own land, right? They own homes. They live in the cities. They're an important part of French society and the French economy. However, they're not producers when it comes to food, right? They don't own land. They pay a lot of taxes, yes. However, what's really important to kind of note here is that 7% of the bourgeoisie, right? We talked about how wealthy they were. And here's a good example of that. That 7% of the bourgeoisie own 25% of the land. And then you have the rural farmers that own about 40% of that land. So when you really look at it right there, when you really take a look at it, 10% of the population, who are the wealthy, own 65% or 60%, I'm terrible at math, of the land in France. Okay? So when you, again, see who's kind of the driving force behind the French Revolution, a lot of it's going to be those bourgeoisie, because they're the ones who kind of are really being impacted the most. Okay? Now, I should say in the pocketbook. When it comes to other things, people in the cities and the rural areas are also impacted heavily by the revolution. But what this is kind of painting a picture of is that, the importance of the role of the bourgeoisie in the revolution, but also recognizing that it's not as simple as just being the haves and the have-nots, right? The bourgeoisie very much were haves. But again, keep in mind what they did lack, what they did not have was that political equality and those equality when it comes to natural rights. So there's really 5 major reasons behind the French Revolution. And I'm not going to really get into too many of them today. I'll go through the notes very quickly on them. But essentially the one that I'm going to hit mostly on is economic issues, political issues. Okay. And I want to make it simple for you guys, right? Lack of food, money problems, plus ineffective leadership and governance equals revolution, right? And that's kind of sort of what we're seeing here with this little, combination of these 5 things. So we have this social structure that is unfair. It's unequal. There's privilege amongst the first and second estates. And the third estate obviously bears the brunt of a lot of the unfair tax codes, which of course we know is economic. Political turmoil is Louis XVI was, there's a lot of, famous quotes about Louis XVI, and many of them are, not very flattering. Because he was sort of this person who really didn't understand the outside world. He was raised, very insulated. He was raised, the term was with a silver spoon in his mouth. He had all he could ever want. And even on top of that, he was sort of noted as not really being the most intelligent person. So eventually when he does kind of take leadership, he was known for being a person to whoever was the last person to talk with him, that's what he'd go along with. He was very indecisive. He often relied on a lot of people, and he got a lot of bad information. And a lot of times he was completely clueless what was truly going on around him. Okay. And that's a major part of why things were sort of falling apart in France. But this is the big one. Okay. The big one is economic issues, right? Deficit spending. Spending more than you're bringing in, right? The King's Palace at Versailles cost a ton of money to operate and run. On top of that, you spend a ton of money on wars, right? You have major inflation going on because you're overspending. And on top of that, you have this farming crisis, where now you have massive food shortages. And we know about supply and demand. When the food supplies are low, the cost goes up. But also the government's suffering because, they don't have enough money. They're not bringing enough revenue in. So they have to raise taxes. Who are they raising taxes on? The third estate, right? Not only the wealthy bourgeoisie, but those people who are living in the cities who need that money to buy food because they don't produce it themselves. So you can understand why these people in the urban areas are going to be getting worked up, right? They're waiting in line at a market. They're trying to buy food with the money that they earned that day, and they get to the front and there's very little left and it costs a lot of money, right? Well, how are they gonna help their family survive? How are they going to continue to do this day in and day out, right? And they're going to look around and other people are going to be worked up too. So you can see why they're going to be the most volatile, because they're the ones who see this injustice the most. They experience it the most. Obviously, we have the Enlightenment principles, which sort of act as a catalyst, act as sort of the driving force and the inspiration for the revolution. Kind of like, this is the answer to the perceived problems. Okay. And finally, this external or international, right? France, trying to build this empire, loses the 7 Years' War, spends a bunch of money on it, and spends a bunch of money trying to help the Americans gain independence, right? This spending really significantly hurts France. On top of all the other economic issues they have, it basically breaks them, okay? Now, one of the things that happens is, the king has the ability to call the States General. States being, we know, the different social groups, and the general basically being an assembly of those different people. The king hasn't done it in a really long time. Why? Because, the king is basically afraid that if these parties meet, they're going to demand a constitution be signed. They're going to demand that the government change from this absolute system to a limited monarchy. Well, because of the problems, the king, who you can see sitting in the background there on the little throne, calls the Estates General. Representation from the three different estates. And one of the things you're going to notice in here is, there's the clergy, there's the nobles, and there's your commoners in the third estate. They're all basically given one vote. Okay? And, the king's like, we need to fix our tax problem because we're broke. And the clergy and the nobles are like, we vote not to tax us. Okay, cool. And the third estate's like, but guys, we're paying all the taxes right now. Can you help us out a little bit? Nope, we vote no. And there's your vote, 2-3 against it. A little bit later on, you're going to hear about the tennis court oath, right? Or the estate, the National Assembly. This is basically what the third estate does. Is they say, you know what, you guys, we're done with you. We're going to go do our own thing, and we're going to come up with a better idea in a better way. So kind of keep that in mind. But this kind of, again, gives you an idea about how unfair this whole practice in this system was. It's systematic, it's generational, and you can see how this could be frustrating to those members of the third estate. So the first phase of the French Revolution is really a moderate phase. It is people sort of agreeing that, hey, we need to change our government, we need to fix problems, let's make a constitutional limited monarchy. The king will have to follow the law, we'll be the legislative branch making the rules, everything will get better. Okay, now, mind you, I'm very much paraphrasing and summarizing this. Constitution is signed. France becomes a constitutional monarchy. But guess what? Things aren't getting any better. Okay, a lot of problems still emerge. And while in the beginning everyone agrees that things have to change, right? Both moderates and radicals agree things need to change. The radicals sort of begin to emerge in using that influence and using the influence that they have over the city workers, the urban population, and also using their anger to kind of help them build more popularity and build more power. The radicals are eventually able to take charge and take control. I apologize if you can hear my son crying upstairs. He's getting near his bedtime here. He's a little moody. Now we kind of begin the bloody phase here, right? This is when you have this change in government where the monarchy is abolished and you have the formation of the republic, right? Can't have a monarchy if you don't have a monarch. The king and queen are arrested, they're tried for treason, and they're later beheaded. Okay, this is a government that has all intents and purposes on creating a republic of virtue, a republic of true equality. They're against slavery. They're for true equality amongst men and women. They have a lot, freedom of speech, freedom of press, all of these good things going for it. However, they say, hey, we cannot have these good things. We cannot have this country of true equality and liberty, and we cannot have this republic of virtue until our enemies are removed. This Committee of Public Safety is formed. It is headed up by a guy by the name of Maximilien Robespierre, who is a member of this radical Jacobin party, again, who wants this extreme drastic change. And essentially, he rules as a dictator. He rules through fear and through terror. It's essentially, if you remember the Red Scare from American history, but like that, but much worse. Trials, executions via guillotine. Okay? And it's anyone who is perceived as a threat would get eliminated. Now, obviously, this is something that's unsustainable. And we often see this a lot through dictatorships that rule through fear and rule through violence, is eventually that ends the exact same way. And that's sort of what happens to Maximilien Robespierre. Eventually, he builds enemies within the government who basically, out of fear of losing their own lives, have Maximilien arrested, tried for treason, and of course executed via guillotine. This sort of ends the radical phase of the French Revolution. Here we can see Robespierre being executed. But I love this political cartoon on the left here. You see Maximilien Robespierre, and he's getting ready to pull the cord on the guillotine. And in that guillotine is the executioner, right? Essentially what this is saying is, hey, Maximilien Robespierre is going to get rid of everyone, even the executioner. He's going to be the last person standing. So there was definitely sort of this paranoia, that he had about enemies around him and sort of forcefully creating this change. And it kind of goes back to this thing I was saying earlier about, government kind of works three different ways. You have people who don't want change, people who want gradual change, and people who want drastic and extreme change. And there's good and bad examples of that, throughout history. But this is an example of forcefully trying to make drastic and radical change and how it goes south and how it gets dangerous. Well, like that, you're going to have a reaction. And that reactionary phase is going to be the Directory. This is still a republic. It is a different constitution, different laws. A lot of the rights that were created and equalities that were created were rolled back. This is a government that very much favors the nobility and favors the aristocracy and favors the bourgeoisie. It is not a very effective government. As a result of this, eventually Napoleon Bonaparte, a very popular general amongst the people, a very successful general fighting wars outside of France, comes to power via coup d'etat and changes this directory and essentially the consulate. He becomes the first consul, where he sort of rules as the head of the government. Eventually Napoleon holds a plebiscite, a vote, and he has the people vote to make him emperor, right? So he, of course, very much in a sort of rise to power like Julius Caesar, becomes the emperor of France and the first French Empire. Now, this is a very famous painting by French neoclassic artist Jacques-Louis David, and it's called The Coronation of Napoleon. This is actually a cropped-in version of it. It's actually a massive painting. And in this painting, you can see the story goes, there's a lot of stories around this, but essentially the gist of it is this, is that Napoleon, is supposed to be crowned by the Pope. symbolic of this sort of divine right of kings, that the church backs you, that the church gives you power, and the church is crowning you, right? But the story goes that Napoleon didn't let the Pope put the crown on him. He took the crown and put it on himself, symbolic of him giving himself the power. Not God, not the church, not anyone else. He gave himself the power to rule. Okay. And that's going to kind of begin what your assignment is going to be for today, is to kind of like look into that reign of Napoleon. Now, this last slide here, obviously is not going to be on the test here, but it's interesting because it kind of gives you a big picture look at French government, all the way going back to the 700s with the feudal monarchy, all the way to the 1940s with Nazi-controlled France, and sort of like how this government changes from a constitutional monarchy, to a republic, to an empire, to a constitutional monarchy, to a republic, to an empire, to a republic, right? To essentially a dictatorship controlled by Hitler, and then again to a republic again after that, which it is today, with a couple more constitutions thrown in there. Okay, but that's all I have for you guys today. Hope you listened to all of this. I'm sure probably of my 3 classes, probably 3 of you made it all the way through this. So I applaud you. Thank you for listening. And with that, you guys can go ahead and get to work and have a wonderful, glorious day.